organization, GWL, is composed of 80 women that we have had a common past in multilateral organizations, many of them as well in very senior national positions. And we are committed to two main things. Basically, to a more gender equal and a stronger international system. This is our mission, this is our drive, this is our motto. And we do regularly reports on women in multilateralism, which review the gender composition of the leadership in key roles across the multilateral organization. And as part of this mapping effort on gender equality in decision-making, today we are proud to present our spotlight on women in climate and environment leadership. Women in climate and environment leadership. This is the first report of this kind, and we compare and we analyze gender equality in key climate and environmental institutions, the global ones. So it is something that hopefully you'll be very interested because we are unveiling new data. We want to thank the co-hosts of this event, Empodera Clima, the International Institute for Environment and Development, thank you for being here, Plataforma CIPO, Project Dandelion, and She Changes Climate. We are very, very pleased to join together in co-hosting this event. And before we enter into the findings of the report, of our spotlight, and we give the floor to the panelists, we would like to hear from a unique woman, Mary Robinson. Mary, as you know, was Ireland's first woman president. She served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and UN Special Envoy for Climate Change. Mary is a co-founder of Project Dandelion and is a member of GWL Voices. Mary is a renowned leader on climate justice and women's rights, and we are so honored that you give us the welcoming words. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those warm words and for that nice welcome. It's always good for morale when you get a little bit of welcome like that. And I want to thank everyone actually for coming because I'm, as you've heard, a member both of GWL Voices and also a Dandelion. And I'm going to start by saying something that might perhaps surprise some of you. It was very easy to open this session talking about all the reasons why women are vulnerable, but I'm tired of hearing it, and I suspect you are too, and I think we know it. Women are not just the victims of the climate and nature crisis. We're among its most experienced responders, its most consistent advocates, and, when given the chance, its most effective leaders. So let's stop leading with vulnerability. Not because the statistics aren't real, they are. In the worst case climate scenario, 240 million more women and girls could be pushed into food insecurity by 2050 compared to 131 million men and boys. Water insecurity, extreme heat, vector-borne disease, all fall harder on women. Climate change doesn't create gender inequality, but it takes every inequality that already exists and makes it so much worse. And we know that too. But that framing tells only half the story, and it's frankly the less important half. The most important half is this: when women lead, things happen. They really do. I've sat in rooms where I was the only woman present. Some of you in this room will know exactly what I mean. And I've sat in rooms where women were at the table in real numbers. Those were very different spaces. Different questions get asked. Different solutions make it onto the agenda. Different communities get considered. And yet, women have made up less than 30% of all climate COP presidents since 1995. Across the 7 major climate and environment bodies, the UNFCCC, CBC, UNCCD, GEF, GECF, UNEP, and IPCC, the picture is no better. In an era of compounding crises, we are making the defining decisions of our time with half the world's perspective systematically missing. That's what we're talking about. Women's participation in climate leadership is not a courtesy, it's not a quota, it is a prerequisite for climate action that actually works and that actually makes a difference in people's lives. So when we try to measure this, it matters that we actually can. Until today, that has been harder than it should be because the data has been scattered across institutions, it's been buried in footnotes, it's been published as lists of names rather than statistics we can track and act on over time. Today, GWL Voices changes that. This report, which I'm happy to just hold up and flag, this report gives advocates, negotiators, and policymakers the evidence to move from a statement we all know to be true to proof we can use. And I look forward to unpacking it and showing exactly why that matters with all of you in this room and on this great panel that I'll be joining. So this is a moment when we have the evidence, and let's make use of it, not just here in this room, but throughout this meeting here of London Climate Week and right on. Let's really make a difference. Thank you so much.
Super. Thank you so much, President Robinson, for your opening remarks and for really setting the stage for what this conversation is going to be. My name is Nadara Youssef. I'm co-chair of Coalition for the UN We Need, and it is my honor here today to present to you the main findings from this year's report on women in global climate and environmental leadership. So, let's begin with a simple question. As the world negotiates how to respond to climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation, who actually makes those decisions? Who sets the agenda, who chairs the negotiations, and who decides which priorities actually move forward? See, climate governance is often described as a global effort, but governance is not an abstract concept. Governance is specific people setting the rules of the game. And the question at the heart of this new GWL Voices spotlight is whether women are actually represented in the places where those rules are set. In other words, beyond normatively saying we need women at the table, how much climate governance power do they actually exercise? There we go. This year, the GWL Voices Women in Global Climate and Environmental Leadership Spotlight Report looks at qualitative and quantitative data to go about answering that very question. Now, if you retain nothing over the next few minutes, firstly, it might be time for another cup of coffee, but also remember these 3 main takeaways. 1, representation decreases as influence increases. 2, internal institutional policies that range from hiring and promotion to flexible work and harassment protections directly shape who enters, stays, and rises in these organizations. And 3rd, disparities across regions and institutions reveal that progress is neither uniform nor automatic. How did we go about doing this? So, GWL looked at 7 of the most influential climate and environmental negotiations, conventions, and organizations and funds that we have. This includes the 3 sister or Rio conventions. And the point I'll try to make over the next 7.5 minutes is that women's representation is not a diversity issue, it's a governance issue. Let's break it down. One of the most striking findings in this report is what I like to call the climate governance paradox. So when women make up approximately 90% of national gender focal points. So when the system needs expertise on inclusion, participation, and gender equality, women are overwhelmingly present. But when we move into broader strategic leadership roles, that representation drops sharply. The people asked to advise the system are often not the ones empowered to lead it. Let's zoom in a bit at COP presidencies where this phenomena becomes most visible. But you know what? There's going to be a lot of bad news coming your way this week. So let's start with a little bit of good news. Here is your official London Climate Week good news break. You are welcome. At the delegate level, the latest Convention on Biological Diversity, COP, achieved parity in party composition. The CBD is also headed toward this standard for heads of delegation and bureau membership. Okay, back to COP presidencies. These are among the most influential positions in global climate governance, as many of you know. Since 1995, women have accounted for just over 1/4 of COP climate presidents. In the Diversification Convention, that figure falls to only 12%. The Biodiversity Convention performs better, but even there, women have still held fewer than 30% of presidencies across its history. So what's the impact of this representation filtering process as we move from labor toward decision-making power? And why is it about more than just representation? Firstly, it limits the types of perspectives in decision-making, which means we're not optimizing our governance systems. Secondly, it barricades the ability of gender expertise to influence broader institutional agendas. Thirdly, it prevents a core set of climate governance issues that are relevant to everyone from ever getting the bureaucracy and negotiation, the diplomacy they so desperately need. Think of it this way. We spend a lot of time saying we need all hands on deck to change the climate, and then we spend a remarkable amount of time deciding whose hands to count. Okay, now that I have sufficiently brought down the mood in the room, here's another good news break. You are welcome. Across multiple indicators, COP presidents, delegates, heads of delegation, and bureau members, the Convention on Biological Diversity repeatedly demonstrates stronger female representation. And this tells us something extremely important. It tells us that these outcomes are not inevitable. They're institutional. If one system can move closer to parity, it suggests that policies, incentives, and organizational culture can make a measurable difference. In other words, the question is not whether progress is possible, the evidence shows that it already is. Still, while many institutions have adopted gender strategies and inclusive HR frameworks, implementation remains uneven. Few organizations provide online information about structured leadership pathways for women, and even fewer publish gender disaggregated staffing data. The absence of transparent monitoring undermines accountability and slows progress. However, the recently adopted UNFCCC Gender Action Plan shows that important progress on women's participation in leadership is still possible and continues to take place. Okay, having zoomed in on institutional policy, let's now quickly zoom out for institutional history. Okay, this is a big graph, but I promise you I will take you through it. So this graph shows years of apex leadership in key climate organizations. Each bar represents a year or a time period in which someone was a leader. I will let you figure out which color represents the women and which color represents the men. From 1972 to 2025, across the 7 institutions analyzed, women have held top leadership positions in, as President Robinson told us, only 30.3% of all observed years. In addition, on average, male mandates extend to 7.1 years, while women mandates last only 4.6 years. The Green Climate Fund does approach parity, but notably, the IPCC, the world's leading scientific authority on climate change, has never had a woman chair, not one since 1988. Apparently, we've been able to model the Earth's climate system with extraordinary precision, but electing a woman chair seems to be the harder technical challenge. These institutions help shape not only climate policy, but also global climate knowledge. So this right here is a picture of power, of who influences what is prioritized, and therefore what decisions are made. The story is also not geographically uniform. Women's leadership is strongest in parts of Europe, but remains significantly lower across Africa and the Asia-Pacific. This means that gender inequality and geopolitical inequality often reinforce one another, which is a diplomatic way of saying barriers have a way of collaborating. But this means that breaking one could help us overcome another. All right. The climate community survives on hope and coffee. I've already told you to get the coffee, so this is the hope portion. Women have always contributed to the global climate governance. The stories of their lived experience, which you can also read in this report, make that unmistakably clear. The challenge is that their presence has not been matched by equal influence. As the climate crisis becomes more complex, more interconnected, more consequential, exclusion is not an equity problem, it's a governance risk. Because this is it. It's all hands on deck. The future of climate diplomacy will depend not simply on whether women are present in the room, but on whether they shape the agenda, define the priorities, and make the decisions. Because meaningful participation is not the end point. Leadership is. Thank you very much. It is now my absolute pleasure to invite a fantastic young climate activist in this intergenerational discussion that we are having to moderate us through the next portion. Shia Batista, please take the stage.
Well, thank you very much for this report. I actually think this, and I've been in these spaces of climate negotiations since my first COP was 2019, so COP 25 in Madrid, which was supposed to be in Chile, which I was very excited about because my mom is Chilean. But then it turns out that in these years that I've been there, now 6 years, it's this reinforcing thing where over and over again we have to fight for representation at the very least, but also how do we actually make the voices of women heard time and time again. So this is incredible findings. Thank you so much for sharing them. I think all of us now have statistics and data to go through our week with and saying this is not fair, and it keeps reinforcing itself. But like you said, the good news is that systems work in shells, and when we can break the system in one part, it has repercussions all across. Somebody once told me either systems break together or blossom together. So I think we can try to make them blossom. So it's an honor to be here. It's a joy to be here. My name is Shia Bastida. I'm a climate justice activist, and I'm the executive director and co-founder of Re-Earth Initiative, and I'm also a dandelion. So that makes me very happy. And today we're going to have an incredible panel, but before we get there, we're going to watch a video of an incredible activist from Brazil. Her name is Renata Koch, and she couldn't join us today in person, but we will watch a video of her organization, Empodera Clima.
When I first joined the global climate movement, I was just a teenager. I had the privilege of witnessing the adoption of the Paris Agreement at COP21, and I saw something extraordinary. Young people and women community leaders from around the globe realized that we had a place in shaping climate policy. And over the last decade, the youth and the feminist climate movements have grown into such a powerful global force. But yet, still, we didn't see the translation of what was happening in the UN climate negotiation spaces into the reality of the local communities. And that's why 7 years ago, I founded Empodera Clima. Our mission has been to connect these worlds, to translate global climate and gender commitments into local action, and to ensure that young women are not only affected by climate policies, but actively shaping it. Because the truth is that climate change is not gender neutral. And we still face major gaps. We still lack the gender disaggregated data that we need to guide governments at the national and local levels. We still don't have climate adaptation plans that are considering the different ways that these crises impact women. I saw this firsthand in the devastating floods in my home state. When gender perspectives had not been incorporated into preparedness planning, the emergency responses had to improvise, work to support gender-based violence contention, and it all became an afterthought. Protecting women became an afterthought. So here's the thing. We need women in leadership, in the presidencies, in the UN Secretary General's role, yes. But we also need more gender-responsive climate financing policies and evidence, just like in the Spotlight report that we're launching today. So while we navigate these global spaces, let's remember that we still need stronger connections and bridges between multilateral spaces and local realities. We need intergenerational leadership that values the voices of young people as partners. Because when climate governance reflects the diversity of the people that it's serving, the results are just going to be more effective and more resilient. Thank you. Obrigada.
So thank you so much to Renata. I know she's here with us in spirit, and she is leading one of the most influential climate organizations that advocate for young women to be part of these processes. So now I would like to invite our panel on stage. Firstly, I want to invite Mary, and for you to all sit in this order, please. Mary, Bianca, Mayra, and Karen, please. Welcome them on stage. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to just do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll get straight into the panel. As a reminder, this is a live stream, so we do have a hard out at 12. So apologies if I have to jump in, but it's to get us moving along and for everyone to hear your incredible perspectives. So I don't have to introduce Mary. Mary is one of my biggest inspirations. Okay, that's enough. Mary said that's enough. But I just want to say Mary is one of the people who show me what leadership is like and what is possible. So thank you, Mary, for inspiring so many of us. Then we have Bianca Pitt, who is an advisor to the environmental charity sector, an activist and campaigner, and an environmental funder and founder. She is the co-founder of She Changes Climate. So everyone, welcome Bianca. Up next, we have Mayra Foley. She's the executive director and co-founder of Plataforma CIPO, a women-led Brazilian-based think tank specializing in international relations and climate action. Give it up for Mayra. And last but not least, we have Karen Wong Perez. Is a senior researcher at IIED. She works on climate and gender justice, ensuring that the voices and priorities of historically underrepresented groups, including indigenous, Afro-descendant, and pastoralist women, are reflected in decision-making processes. Everyone, please welcome Karen. So for this first round of questions, you each will have around 3 minutes to answer them. And we'll start with Mary. We are in the midst of a rapidly intensifying climate crisis, and at the same time, many geopolitical crises are emerging and escalating all around us. While the multilateral system seems unable to keep peace and deliver timely, effective solutions. Do you see the underrepresentation of women in climate governance as another symptom of the failing multilateral system, or as the root cause?
I see it as both, Shie, but since you said nice things about me, I have to say I first met Shie in Madrid at that your first COP. You were, I think, 15 at the time, maybe 14? 17, okay. And your leadership is also, really striking, and you're now a film star, of course, so, but I say in answer that it's both because the underrepresentation of women in climate governance is never a kind of passive flaw. It's deliberate. It's policy. It's system. It's a system problem, as we've been hearing, and it's basically a mirror of systemic injustice, and an outdated patriarchal multilateral system that we have right across the board, we need to realize that, and it's a symptom because the system locks its door to the very people who would give different perspectives, who would address in a different way, who would move the agenda, who would want it to work for people, especially those at grassroots and indigenous and basic human rights and equality. And it's simultaneously a catastrophic root cause. When we shut women out of the room, their lived reality isn't present. It's not valued. It's not important. But look at the lived reality of women around the world. They are the infrastructure at grassroots level. I'm very close to SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. Their innovation, what they do, is extraordinary. Project Dandelion has worked with IFAD, with women in Ethiopia on water management. As a result, instead of one harvest, they got 3 harvests. I mean, women are making so many changes of a really important nature as part of their building of resilience, etc., and yet that is not reflected at the higher levels, and that's where I think it's a root cause, and it just also doesn't reflect the nature of the crisis, the climate and nature crisis, because you lack the input of the solid, grounded, working on something that gives you truth, what you're doing, and women are doing so much, and it doesn't get reflected in a way that would improve and help decision making. So we're just left with a self-reinforcing cycle of injustice, in fact. So it is both. And I think this report will help in the climate space to show, so much of the leadership at important levels, whether it's indigenous, young, grassroots, infrastructure building, we're marking the year of the smallholder farmer. The smallholder woman farmer is not small, because when you see what's happening, and that's what we have to do, we have to flip the thing to understanding that this is actually really important what's going on. It should not get less than 1% of climate finance. We should move the money rapidly. If we had more women in the room who could tell the story as you would all tell it, if we could, bang the door and tell that story, it would make such a difference.
Thank you, Gray. And going on a very similar conversation, Bianca, you work with a lot of women on the grassroots, women from underrepresented backgrounds all around. And I want to hear from you about the barriers that you have seen women face, because we know that, like we've said many things, sometimes people think that gender representation is the end goal, but we also want diverse women to be able to be in decision-making spaces, because there's a big gap from just having women to having our diversity included in decision-making. So what can you share with us about those barriers, and how can we overcome them?
Thank you, Shia. So while the latest GWL Voices report highlights the persistent barriers that women face while trying to access influence at the multilateral climate institutions, many of the women leaders that we work with at She Changes Climate point to similar, but often even more pronounced, actually, challenges at the national level. So a recurring lesson is that representation alone is not enough. Women from frontline and historically marginalized communities are frequently invited into consultation processes, but they are rarely present where decisions are actually made, budgets are allocated, and priorities are set. So participation can therefore be symbolic rather than influential. Many leaders also describe how multiple forms of exclusion intersect. Gender barriers are compounded by factors such as race, ethnicity, indigenous identity, class, disability, age, geography, and language. Women from rural, indigenous, and frontline communities often face significant practical obstacles to participation, including lack of funding, limited access to information, travel constraints, unpaid care responsibilities, and processes that are conducted in technical language or dominant national languages. Another lesson is that climate governance structures often privilege certain types of expertise. Lived experience, traditional knowledge, and community leadership are frequently undervalued compared to technical, academic, or political credentials. As a result, the women who are most directly affected by climate impacts are often excluded from shaping the policies designed to address them. Power dynamics within institutions also remain a significant barrier. Many women leaders tell us that decision-making spaces continue to be shaped by entrenched networks and informal power structures that favor established actors, particularly men, of course, from political and economic elites. This can make it difficult for new voices to gain access, build influence, or advance into leadership positions. At the same time, the women we work with consistently demonstrate that more inclusive decision-making leads to stronger outcomes. No surprise. When frontline and marginalized women are meaningfully involved, climate policies are often more responsive to local realities, more equitable, and better able to address the interconnected challenges of climate change, livelihoods, health, food security, and social justice. So the key lesson is that inclusion must indeed be designed into climate governance systems from the outset. That means moving beyond consultation towards shared decision-making, investing in leadership pipelines, because that is particularly missing at the moment, and particularly for underrepresented women, providing resources that enable participation and recognizing diverse forms of leadership and knowledge. And without these changes, many of the people most affected by climate change will continue to have the least influence over the decisions that shape their futures.
These findings, and it just feels like they keep repeating over and over again. But I do want to say something before we go to Maida, which is sometimes when I go to international spaces, people ask me, and how hard is it to be a woman here? How have you not been heard? And I have to tell them, you know what? Honestly, a door has not been closed in my face because I'm a woman. Maybe because I'm an indigenous woman, maybe because I'm a young woman, but not because I'm a woman. And then I have to tell people, and I have people to thank, like Mary, like Christiana Figueres, so many women in these spaces, like Osprey who's sitting here, Pat who's sitting here, my mom who's sitting right there in the back. My mom and my dad met at the first Earth Summit in 1992 when being a woman in that space was difficult. But I do want to say that in just 1 to 2 generations, we have made incredible advancements in us not having the door shut in our face because we are women from diverse backgrounds who are bringing different perspectives. So I think that deserves a round of applause for the women who have for decades been able to hold the door open for us to join in. And next I want to go to you, Mayara, because you specialize on the intersection of international relations and climate. And I want to know from you, what does it actually take in climate governance to have this gender parity achieved? And how is that going to change the outcomes that we see in climate governance, especially as we saw across these 7 different areas of the UN climate negotiations?
Thank you, Xi. I will start by congratulating GWL for another impactful report. As Mary Robson is saying, it gives us the evidence, the data, and the tools to advocate for greater equity. And I'll perhaps answer to your question by giving an idea for a new report for GWL. Because Of course, it is important for us to have this assessment of where we stand in climate governance, where we are in terms of negotiators, especially those in leadership positions. So talking here about COP presidencies, but also head of delegations, etc. And we know we're not doing well, although things have improved. But climate governance is shifting gradually, perhaps, towards an era of implementation, right? We had finalized the rules books of the Paris Agreement. Most of countries have delivered the third round of NDCs. They have developed national adaptation plans, transparency reports, long-term plans, etc., etc. So the framework is there. It's very clear now that we need to advance on implementation. And when we talk about implementation, we are essentially talking about means of implementation, and especially finance. And then when we look at finance, the situation is way, way, way worse than the climate governance, both domestically and internationally. And I'll give the example of my own country, Brazil. Brazil has done a great effort over the past few years in bringing finance ministers and authorities into climate governance. It started during its presidency of the G20, where for the first time it created a framework where both the Sherpa and the finance track of the G20 came together to discuss climate finance. And it continued that work through COP30 presidency and created a circle of finance ministers, again, with the same motivation to make sure that those who are thinking about budgets, investment decisions are on the table. When we look domestically, Brazil has only had a single woman Minister of Finance, and for a very short period of time. And the situation is the same for most countries, I'd say. And internationally, GWL Women in Multilateralism report already demonstrates that most international financial institutions have never been led by women. So that means that women are not in the discussions and they are not part of the decisions related to where the money goes, which is essential when we talk about implementation. So this is from the representation and governance perspective. But when you think of policies, it's the same. I mean, we know that there is not an internationally conducive environment for either climate finance nor gender equality. ODA is shrinking. We have the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. We have the commitment to scale finance to 1.8 trillion. But the reality is the money is not coming. And as Mary Robinson said, the data is opaque, but we know that it's not much more than 1-2% of climate finance that goes to gender responsive policies. So we need to change that, of course, and considering how difficult things are at the moment, my suggestion would be to also look at the role of national development banks and regional development banks, because they are doing great things domestically in countries in Latin America and in Africa, in the global south, which are waiting for those promises that never reach. So perhaps through the national efforts and regional efforts, we could perhaps increase a little bit of the money that should be going to those who are most affected. And we know that those are women, girls, indigenous peoples, and those in the front line. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that very rich answer. And it reminds me of just now the conference that we had in Colombia, the conference to transition away from fossil fuels. And my country, Mexico, sent in our head negotiator for the UNFCCC process. And they said, the Mexican government said that Colombia had not invited them as a country. They had only invited their environment minister. Therefore, they were not going to take the conference that seriously, and it was, quote unquote, a meeting of friends, which if you're transitioning away from fossil fuels, it's not a meeting of friends, right? It's like all hands on deck to do a whole energy transition. And so Mexico did not want to send neither the energy minister nor the finance minister, and thought that sending the environment, not even the environment minister, but somebody representing the environment ministry was the answer. And who is it? It's the woman who has been leading our negotiation process for as long as I can remember, but she has not been given the power to make decisions on where the money goes or how we actually transition away from fossil fuels. And so it's who they send, how important, the attribution of importance that they give to these spaces, and then actually having not only the people in the room who can say yes to money, but also that those people are almost never women. So it kind of, feeds into that. But thank you for that answer, because that is really what we need now, the implementation of direct finance, access to finance for frontline communities and women on the ground. So now I want to go to you, Karen, because you have done a lot of work in the representation of women of least developed countries in climate negotiations. So could you talk to us about the findings of that report and how they are similar to this report from GWL? And why do you think, or like, what do you think about those similarities, if any?
Thank you. It's a true privilege to be here. I will talk about the similarities and complementarities between two reports. The report that is presented today, that is fantastic, and a report that we launched last year that focused on why is there underrepresentation of women, particularly from the 45 least developed countries. So both reports are highly complementary. The GWL Voices report understands or examines why where the underrepresentation happens, and IID report focus on why women are not there. So it's based on a series of case studies, a survey, and interviews with climate negotiators from LDCs. And what we found is that, yes, as the report shows, women from these countries continue to be among with the lowest representation in the UN climate negotiations. And I would like to highlight three findings. First is, as was mentioned earlier, that women are not facing isolated challenges or barriers. They are facing interconnected systems of barriers that reinforce each other. And we identified 4 domains of barriers. One is sociocultural gender norms, institutional and governance, unequal access to knowledge, skills, and political capabilities, and unequal access to finance. And underpinning all, as you can imagine, is the gender social norms, which we found have an important role in shaping, in explaining what happens before people set foot at COP. Shaping women and girls' capacity to aspire to occupy positions of leadership, feelings of self-confidence, self-esteem, entitlement, and at the same time, gender norms also shape gender stereotypes, which oftentimes become very embedded in institutions through the perceptions of those already in positions of power and that act as gatekeepers. So there are some examples in the report. I invite you to read it, to explore in more detail what are those examples that we found that contribute to that system that reinforce continuously. A similarity in the findings is that presence does not automatically translate into influence, and it was previously discussed by different speakers, so that strongly mirrors the report. Examining the LDCs, we found similarly that women remain underrepresented as heads of delegation and national focal points. And we also found that many countries still lack transparent nomination criteria and clear and transparent nomination processes. So that's what happens before at the national level. Another consistent finding that is also has been also identified here is that increasing women's representation is essential, but it is not enough. So in the research, we asked participants, what does meaningful participation actually looks like? And most of the respondents converged in the idea that meaningful participation has to do with the idea of creating pathways to influence in different ways, and that influence is rarely exercised by individuals acting alone in just one sector. Women negotiators are more influential when they are backed by other negotiators, by women's organizations, by civil society, strong women caucuses. So that invites us to think beyond individual women's leadership to a more collective idea of women's leadership, one that is based on coalitions, networks, solidarity, alliances. And a final finding that I would like to share is that if barriers are are an interconnected system, what we need is an interconnected system of responses. No single actors hold the silver bullet to disrupt that very, very powerful system. So responses must also be polycentric and systemic. It reminds me of the whole of society approach. We need a whole of society approach to address the barriers. So governments need to reform their nomination processes. They need to have clear selection criteria. Funders need to remove financial barriers. University needs to expand education opportunities on climate and STEM subjects for women and girls. Communities and civil society organizations need to continue challenging gender norms that shape girls' capacity to aspire and to imagine themselves in positions of power. So I will close with that we need a whole of society approach to leadership that broadens the definition of women's leadership, but also highlights the responses or the responses needed from different sectors of society.
I really loved the perspective on meaningful participation, because we are asked so often, what's meaningful participation? What does that mean? And recently, my organization started a fellowship for especially young women, young indigenous women, to be in the negotiation process. And actually, one of our fellows has been named focal point of adaptation in the Indigenous Caucus. But why? Because there had been no one there, right? It's like the topics are so hard and so complex that people burn out rapidly because they don't have that support system. And it's usually one or two people in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus that are following the negotiations and have the funding to be able to sustain the participation year after year. And there's a lot of opportunities that are like once a year, or in universities that they take the students one time. And that is not meaningful participation. I can say personally that I didn't understand the COP process till the third time I went, because it's very overwhelming. You go and it's so many hallways and so many people and so many negotiation rooms, you don't even know where you can enter or not. And it's until you understand the process that meaningful participation can actually happen. And when we did a survey to our fellows about what it was like for them to have meaningful participation, the number one thing they said is, if I don't know what I'm there for and I cannot understand the words in the room, I cannot participate meaningfully. So it's also about the training and enough preparation to be able to actually not just be a face and be a statistic of filling a gender quota, right? It's about having all of the information needed to be able to act upon. So I think it's very similar, not just with women in general, but also with other sectors like youth or frontline communities. So thank you so much for bringing that, especially the similarities amongst both reports. And now to close, we have 1 minute closing round question. And I want not your advice on what you would say to the people in power who don't really think that gender inclusiveness or gender parity is important, but what narratives have you seen that do not work so that we stop reinforcing those narratives, and what narratives have worked, and kind of what arguments have worked so people understand that women have to be in those places of decision making. So I'll start with Karen, and then we'll go on the way back to Mary.
Yes. So I think that the first thing that we need to recognize is that we are still in the position that we need to convince others. And so my first reflection is that decision makers are very different and respond to different type of arguments. So the first step is to know your audience and tailor your message. Some respond to economic arguments, some respond to instrumental arguments, human rights, practical examples. But I think that not all resistance that we face comes from a lack of evidence. I think that we oftentimes assume that better data or better evidence will shape or change minds. And I still think that many times this resistance comes from the preference to maintain existing power dynamics and existing status quo. So I think that we need to also recognize that there must be there are times that no matter how hard we try or how well-crafted evidence and arguments we put forward, we need different strategies to overcome the barriers. And for me, one of those strategies is, again, going back to history and see what has worked in the past to move progress, and that is coalitions, alliances, organization. So what I will say to decision makers is, if you're really serious about the whole of society as a way to address to existential crisis, then you don't need to leave behind or out 50% of the population. You need to invest in a whole of society, meaning of women leadership. That includes women from communities, women leaders from communities, from indigenous communities, in the workplace, in the private sector, in the government, in politics. And that is the way in which we can have that collective pathways for influence.
Thank you.
Okay. Very unfortunately, I believe that we are in a moment that nor the moral or the legal argument are being able to convince policymakers, right? Telling states that, well, it's your historical responsibility, you need to fund climate finance. It is clearly not working. Telling them, well, you're breaching your international obligations. It's clearly not working because states are more and more comfortable in breaking the law anyway. That doesn't, of course, mean that we should give up on the moral and legal argument. I think we need to use the tools that we have. We had a recent ICJ advisory opinion on states' obligation on climate action. We still should be, in my opinion, be talking about common but differentiated responsibilities. But I'll go back to the issue of finance again. I think we need to be using more and more the economic arguments to convince people. And very briefly, another example of my country, Brazil. Today, around 90% of cars in Brazil use biofuels, so they are flex fuel, right? Either gas or ethanol. And we haven't reached that number by telling people that we need to be more sustainable. We convinced people because simply it was cheaper. So it was the cost. So in my view, now we need to do better work in demonstrating how investing in climate and gender equality will bring prosperity to people. We need to be talking about how we generate jobs, how we address the issue of access to energy poverty, etc. So dominating this economic language, which is often very complex, numbers and numbers and numbers, will be very important if we want to attract at least a tiny bit more of investments for this agenda.
Also, I'm speaking for the She Changes Climate Collective, but I'm going to leave the notes aside and speak from our practice. When we set up She Changes Climate, we spoke to some framing experts and we asked them how we should best frame this challenge. And they said, do not use the word gender at any cost. We did, but I'm still thinking about this, okay? I held a presentation about the state of the world and to a very, very big multinational corporation a few years ago, and then looking at all the social inequalities, etc. And at the end, and the innovation board, this global innovation board that was sitting there listening to me at the end was completely speechless. And in there, I thought, if they don't ask a question, it's a bad sign. So I went up to them in the break and I said, no, is there anything you want to ask? And the woman who reports to the owners of the company from this board said, my one question is, how do we convince those who are in power to give up power? That was, again, a question that has stayed with me. I think what we've got to do is really build on a shared sense of frustration. We all feel the frustration, men and women together. But we also build on a shared sense of hope. And if we don't feel the hope, we have to build the hope again and very, very clearly also phrase it out. And we have to talk about the discomfort we have with change, because change is hard and it is uncomfortable and we're not looking forward to it. No one is, but there's hope. And finding answers together is going to be the critical challenge, but also opportunity.
Thank you.
Well, Shea, I think I'd like to build on what this excellent panel has been saying. First of all, the IIED report making it clear it's not just individual women leaders getting positions, it's much more the infrastructure of support. And this is very much the Project Dandelion approach. We want the women who have access to the rooms, who can be at the table, to speak with and on behalf of those who are creating the infrastructure that's making a difference at grassroots level, and make their voices and their work more understood and more appreciated and more financed and more resourced. The point about language, I think, you know, I agree very much about the importance of speaking with the evidence about finance, speaking about the cost of inclusion, of exclusion, for example, as being a very big factor. You know, the economic losses from climate impacts that fall on communities without a voice, not bringing into the table the evidence that we're talking about. And on your point about don't mention gender, I think the point is, don't talk about gender equality in isolation as somehow a woman's issue. It has to be embedded in the institutions, embedded in the financial approaches, that's the way to deal with it. And I think that's really very important. And, you know, there is a frustration, I think, in all of us. And I'm glad to say it's in a lot of supportive men who see a world that's in a right mess at the moment because of a lot of male, bloody, you know, autocratic agendas and things. We won't go into it in detail. And actually, we do need the balance. Yeah. We need the different perspectives. The world would be in a much better place. So, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to the whole incredible panel. This wraps us up for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I learned a lot. I hope we can take all of this into our week and our lives and our work. Now the live stream has ended, so I want you to just give everybody a big round of applause, and we can take a picture.